This is going to be a continuation of the topic which we broached last time, where we were looking at Richard Taylor's argument about the meaning of life. And so we should probably first recap a few points that we made about Taylor's argument in the previous video. First, he wants to explain what it is that defines meaninglessness. He wants to explain what is that defining characteristic of a meaningless activity, a meaningless action, or a meaningless life. That his defining characteristic of meaninglessness is this: repetitious cyclical activity that never comes to anything. Or as he describes it in another way, an activity that never has a significant culmination. And of course, the image that he used to illustrate this point was the story of the myth of Sisyphus. So here we have this man who was cursed by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain and back down, up a mountain, back down for all of eternity. And it wasn't, the point of this labor wasn't to produce anything, it wasn't to create anything, it was just ordered by the gods to be done for its own sake. Pointless activity going on forever. Okay, so this is what Taylor thinks characterizes meaninglessness. Now, in addition to that, what Taylor wants to make, and this is where we left off in our previous video, the other point he wants to make is that this defining characteristic of meaninglessness applies to not only all biological life, but human life in particular. Right, so we talked about last time how, and really we were focusing last time on this first part, the repetitious and cyclical activity aspect. He says, well, if you think about the nature of human life and all biological life, individuals engage in various activities. The things they produce and the activities they engage in aren't going to last forever. Much of the work of the human endeavor is left off to the next generation, who then makes a sacrifice for the sake of the following generation, which produces the following generation, the following generation. And the point is that when you take a wide view of biological life, whether it's humans or the cicadas or the glowworms in New Zealand, what you see is what he calls a vast machine feeding off of itself. You see just vast cycles of life repeating and repeating and repeating over and over again. So if that's true, if that's one way to think about human life, then it would meet, it seems, the first condition of meaninglessness, this repetitious cyclical activity. But what about the second part? And we said before that this is what's more important. The idea that human life never comes to anything. And remember, we said this is more important because if you go back to the case of Sisyphus, imagine that he had to push those boulders up and down the mountain for a very, very long time, repetitious cyclical activity. But in the end, the stones were going to create a great, enduring, and lasting temple, a beautiful temple. Well, look, I mean, that might not be the most fun life, the most pleasurable life, it might be a very boring life, but for all that, he's at least created this beautiful temple, or he's helped to create it in any case. And so it seems there's a point to his actions. So why is it that Taylor thinks that there's a sense in which human life never comes to anything? Right, so this is the point we're going to look at now. So here's the way that Taylor describes our human achievements, and the reason he gives for why everything humans do never comes to a, as he calls it, a significant culmination. So let's read from this passage. We at one point imagined that the labors of Sisyphus finally culminated in the creation of a temple. But for this to make any difference, it had to be a temple that would at least endure, adding beauty to the world for the remainder of time. Right, and this makes some sense. If we imagine Sisyphus pushing the boulders up the hill for a long time, engaging in this boring, toilsome labor to create this temple, but it was going to be immediately knocked down, you'd say, well, okay, I mean, that's nice that he built the temple, but it didn't really last all that long. It's not clear that this was a significant achievement after all. And in a sense, when we take a wide view of human life, Taylor thinks this is what our achievements are like. Our achievements, even though they are often beautiful, are mostly bubbles. And those that do last, like the sand-swept pyramids, soon become mere curiosities, while around them the rest of humankind continues its perpetual toting of rocks, only to see them roll down. Okay, so let's think about this in a couple different ways, right? So think about the goals or plans you have for your life, right? You want to graduate college, and you want to pursue a certain career path, let's say. Well, if you start to think about it, and let's say you really think that career is important, not just, from a monetary point of view for you, but in general for all of humanity, right? Or at least some segment of humanity. It's going to be a beneficial thing. It's going to contribute to society. Well, that's all fine and well, but you know at some point in the future that you won't be doing that career. You know at a certain point that career may not even exist. And so when you think about the fact that everything you're doing will, in some sense, be destroyed at some point, everything that your society is doing will in some sense be destroyed, you might start to wonder, well, at what point do we say that human life no longer has this sort of significant culmination? Taylor continues on, he says, nations are built upon the bones of their founders and pioneers, but only to decay and crumble before long, their rubble then becoming the foundation for others directed to exactly the same fate. So ancient civilizations of the past no longer exist. We have taken their place. Our civilizations will no longer exist, only for a future generation civilization to take its place. And so he makes this point in another way. If we take a less macro look and a more micro look, he says, on a country road, one sometimes comes upon the ruined hulks of a house and one's extensive buildings, all in collapse and spread over with weeds. A curious eye can in imagination construct from what is left a once warm and thriving life, filled with purpose. There was a hearth where a family once talked, sang, and made plans. There were rooms where people loved and babes were born to a rejoicing mother. There are musty remains of a sofa, infested with bugs, once bought at a dear price to enhance an ever-growing comfort, beauty, and warmth. Every small piece of junk fills the mind with what once not long ago was utterly real, with children's voices, plans made, and enterprises embarked upon. So you come across on this country road, this abandoned house, and you imagine the life that was once lived in it, but then you realize, of course, that at this point, it's just abandoned. No one's there. No one's enjoying the company of each other. No one's laying plans and future enterprises to be embarked upon. No one's doing any of those things. Meanwhile, other buildings, institutions, nations, and civilizations sprang up all around, only to share the same fate before long. And if the question, what for, is now asked, what was the point of all that? Why did those people bother sharing that home? Why did they bother making those plans? Why did they bother doing any of the things they did? If the question, what for, is now asked, the answer is clear, so that just this may go on forever. Okay, and so at this point, you might say, well, okay, that's true. I mean, and it just is the case that any human creation, any human endeavor will not last forever. It will be destroyed. But you might say, well, that's fine. I mean, things, they still do last for a long time, and we pass our efforts on to the next generation, and they pick it up. In that sense, we are like Sisyphus, or as Taylor himself says, we pass the task on to our children. But take an even wider view. And this is a passage, this doesn't come from Taylor. This comes from a philosopher named William Lane Craig. And also, I'll read what he says and I'll explain the context of what he's trying to get at. Craig tells that scientists tell us that everything in the universe is growing farther and farther apart. As it does so, the universe grows colder and its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light at all. There will be no heat. There will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and cold recesses of space. A universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. The entire universe marches irreversibly toward its grave. So not only is the life of each individual person doomed, right? So not only is your life going to end, right, with your death, but the entire human race is doomed. Okay, quite a depressing sentiment, I suppose, but you can see the point that's coming across here. It's not enough to just say that, well, the next generation will pick up where we left off. At some point, all human life and all biological life itself is going to cease to exist. The universe, as it grows farther and farther apart, will no longer, as Craig tells us, be able to support life. And so there's a very deep sense in which every single thing we do is destined for complete, total, and utter destruction. Even in the memory of future people, because there will be no future people, right? We often think, well, I know my life's going to end, but the things I did and the people I helped and the relationships I built will carry on in memory. But that won't even be the case. There will be no memory. It's all complete, total, and utter destruction. Now, just as a sort of side note, the reason Craig brings this up is not to argue that life is meaningless. In fact, he uses this as an example of why we cannot live a meaningful life without God. He says, if God doesn't exist, our lives, our death is the end of our life. The human species will at some point no longer remain, and nothing will be permanent. I think this is really the key. If you have the sort of intuition that the fact that life will eventually be wiped out makes your life less meaningful, it may be because you have an intuition that what we're really searching for is something that's permanent, that's lasting, that cannot be destroyed. And many sort of religious accounts, which would explain where the meaning of life comes from, have just this idea in mind, right? So the idea is that, well, yes, your life will end, yes, the human species will end, but after your death, it will involve some sort of eternal communion with some sort of eternal divine being, right, that we call God. Now, I'm not going to get too far into that issue in this video, and this is not the approach Taylor is going to take, but just keep in mind, this is one approach this is one way someone might go. They might say the only way we can redeem ourselves from this sort of situation, the only way that human life can be meaningful, is if there exists a God, if the communion with a divine entity is in fact possible. Now, Taylor himself rejects that sort of approach. And it's interesting, the comment that he makes on this point. So he says, the two pictures of Sisyphus and our own lives, if we look at them from a distance, are in outline the same and convey to the mind the same image. It is not surprising, then, that we invent ways of denying it. Namely, we invent ways of denying the fact that our lives are really just endless toil to no significant culmination. Our religions, and this is the important point, our religions proclaiming a heaven that does not crumble, their hymnals and prayer books declaring a significance to life of which our eyes provide no hint whatever. So we all realize that there's a very deep sense in which everything in this life is transitory, it's not permanent, it's subject to change, and will be destroyed. So, in response, Taylor says, well, we have many sort of religious accounts which say, no, there is something permanent, there is something lasting, there is something eternal, which beyond this life you can find meaning in. And he says, if these religious accounts fail to convince us, then there's other ways that we sort of get at this. Then earthly ideals such as universal justice and brotherhood are conjured up to take their places and give meaning to our seemingly endless pilgrimage. Some final state that will be ushered in when the last obstacle is removed and the last stone pushed to the hilltop. So if you don't prefer a sort of religious account, you might serve the same sort of need by saying, well, look, and this is what Mill, I think, was getting at. Yes, I'm not going to achieve all the goals I have in this life. Everything I create may be temporary and not permanent. But at some point, we are going to achieve this universal justice. We're going to improve the humankind, the human species. Of course, this, in an ultimate sense, becomes more difficult to believe when we consider that, in fact, the human species is heading towards its own destruction. But Taylor's point is that these ideas of how we can find permanence in a world where everything is changing and everything's subject to destruction, such ideas serve a very real need. We want to have some sense that our lives are contributing to some significant permanent culmination. Unfortunately, Taylor says, when we actually step back, when we actually look realistically at what human life is like, that just isn't something that's possible. So what does all this mean? Well, first, it means that for Taylor, human life is objectively meaningless. And remember the distinction between these two types of meaning. So objective meaning is a sort of meaning to be found in some end goal that is valuable no matter what anyone thinks of it. And Taylor says, well, our lives can't be objectively meaningful because at the end goal is simply destruction, whether of your life or the human species as a whole. All we find is just endless propagation with no final end in view. But that brings up another question, because remember, there's also subjective meaning. Subjective meaning isn't so much about the destination. It's not about the final goal. It's about the journey to get there. You have a subjectively meaningful life to the extent that you want to do the things you're doing, you enjoy them, you're passionate about those things, that you have projects that you find fulfilling. And here's what Taylor says about the possibility of subjective meaning being enough for a meaningful life. He says, but here we need to note something else that has been mentioned, but its significance not explored. And that is the state of mind and feeling with which such labors are undertaken. So what if we can't find meaning in our lives from any sort of ultimate end that we're pursuing, but what if we can find meaning in our lives from the state of mind, the feeling, the view we take of what we do, how we feel about it? We noted that if Sisyphus had a keen and unappeasable desire to be doing just what he found himself doing, then although his life would in no way be changed, it would nevertheless have a meaning for him. So remember, that second version of the myth of Sisyphus story, we imagine that Sisyphus has a strange, irrational impulse to roll stones up a mountain. And Taylor's going to make two claims about that. He's going to say, first, that that's actually enough to give Sisyphus a meaningful life. If for whatever reason he had a strange impulse to just roll stones, that's all he wanted to do. There was nothing else he wanted to do with his life except roll stones, and he was perfectly happy with it, then that would be enough for him to have meaning. And secondly, he's going to claim that's what our lives are like. That is human life. We don't think of it that way, because we're lost in our everyday projects. You're thinking about, going to school, going to work. You're thinking about your relationships with other people. You're thinking about your hobbies. You're getting super invested in these things. So on a day-to-day basis, we don't think of what we're doing in that way. But then when you say, well, okay, let me back up, reflect on the fact that everything I achieve or accomplish will someday be destroyed, then there's a sense in which you might say, well, my life does sort of resemble Sisyphus in that sense. It's like I'm programmed by, I guess I would say, my biology and psychology, etc., to want to do a whole host of things that are eventually just going to get destroyed. I'm programmed by my biology and psychology to just participate in this endless cycle of human life where one generation gives way to the next, the next, and the next. Just as Sisyphus was programmed to want to roll hills up mountains for all eternity. One of the major points that Taylor wants to make here is that this is actually a better way of thinking about meaning. And what I mean by a better way, it's better to focus more on the process, more on the journey, than it is the destination. And one of the ways he brings this up is, okay, so imagine this is what life was. There was some specific purpose to life. Everything you do should be oriented toward that purpose. Right? So let's say we're imagining Sisyphus is supposed to roll all these stones up the hill to build the beautiful temple. Okay, and so Taylor says, let us suppose he succeeded in this. That after ages of dreadful toil, all directed at this final result, he did at last complete his temple. Such that now he could say his work was done and he could rest and forever enjoy the result. Now what? So the whole point of his life is to help build this temple. The temple is completed. Well, now what is he supposed to do? What picture now presents itself to our minds? It is precisely the picture of infinite boredom, of Sisyphus doing nothing ever again, but contemplating what he has already wrought and can no longer add anything to, and contemplating it for an eternity. So, if we think that meaning really comes from the destination, from accomplishing some specific task, then that would imply if we were to accomplish that task, there would be nothing left to do. We'd just sit around bored, thinking about what we have accomplished, and for however much longer we're going to live, be in a complete state of utter dissatisfaction. And because that is the case, Taylor thinks, no, what's really more important than the end result is the activity or process of getting there. And it's important that the activity, the process, the journey is something you are passionate about, that you desire, that you think is that you're doing things that you think is important. And so he says, this is surely the way to look at all of life, at one's own life, each day and moment it contains, of the life of a nation, of the species, of the life of the world, and of everything that breathes. Even the glowworms I described, whose cycles of existence over the millions of years seem so pointless when looked at by us, will seem entirely different to us if we can somehow try to view their existence from within. So when we take a look at the life of the glowworms, who just live their life, it seems purely to propagate themselves for the next generation, same thing with the cicadas, all forms of biological life. When we look at that, we say, what a pointless existence. Why are they even there in the first place? Just to be born, propagate, and die. But let's imagine, however odd this might be, he says, imagine trying to view their existence from within. Well, the glowworm is doing what it desires, if that's the right word, to do most. It's in the glowworm's nature, simply to be born, propagate, and die. He continues on, their endless activity, which gets nowhere, is just what it is their will to pursue. This is its whole justification and meaning. So the glowworms in New Zealand, it is their nature, it is their will to engage in this sort of cyclical activity. And he's saying that that activity needs no further justification. There's nothing else it needs for us to say it's meaningful. And he's going to say the exact same thing about human life. And this is one of the final passages of the article. He's essentially going to say that we human beings can live a meaningful life to the extent that we are doing what is our will to do, that we are passionate about the projects we pursue. And the fact that those projects are going to be destroyed, they're going to be undermined, that they're temporary, that many people may not find them important, just doesn't matter. Just like it doesn't matter that we might not find what the glowworms do important. So he says, you no sooner drew your first breath than you responded to the will that was in you to live. You no more ask whether it will be worthwhile or whether anything of significance will come of it than the worms and the birds. And here's the crucial part. The point of living is simply to be living in the manner that it is your nature to be living. So this implies that there are some ways you could live a meaningless life. If you were forced to do things that aren't fulfilling, if you weren't living up to your potential, if you were, wasting away your talents and not truly living a way that was satisfying, not being honest to yourself about what you're passionate about, not trying to pursue those things, those are all ways of living a meaningless life. But provided you are engaging in projects you care about, it doesn't matter that someday those projects will be destroyed. And the fact that this video someday will no longer exist, that none of us will exist, and the fact that the whole human species someday will not exist, doesn't necessarily make this any less meaningful. It's important to me now. I hope I can show you now how these ideas are important. And it just is my nature to want to communicate philosophical ideas to other people. And for Taylor, that's really all I need to live a meaningful life. And so Taylor says, the meaning of life is from within us. It is not bestowed from without. So we should stop there. This is sort of a subtle criticism of the idea that meaning of life comes from God. Right? So he's saying, you don't need the approval of any greater being. You don't need the approval of society. You don't need to feel like you're contributing to something that's absolutely permanent and lasting and that won't be destroyed. Because the meaning of your life ultimately comes from within you. And Taylor says, and this may be a disputable point, that meaning far exceeds in both its beauty and permanence any heaven of which men have ever dreamed or yearned for. So at the end of the day, for Taylor, subjective meaning is all we need to live a meaningful life. And if that's true, it's comforting to the extent that, well, now we can perhaps own up a little more to the idea that everything we do will be undermined and destroyed. We can own up to and say, yes, I realize that nothing I do is permanent. All the same, the journey, the process, the activities I engaged in mattered to me at the time I did them. And I was doing what it was in my nature to do. That, for Taylor, is a meaningful life.